My name is Olivia Grant. I'm 29 years old, and the morning my parents tried to steal my $3.5 million estate, my father didn't ask to come inside. He shoved a recorded deed toward my face and said, "This house is mine now." My mother stood behind him holding a folder marked vacate, and added, "You're out by Friday. Don't make this embarrassing." I looked at the document once and knew something was wrong. The property had belonged to my grandparents before they left it to me, and I had never signed away a single inch of it. Yet there was my name printed beneath language supposedly transferring ownership. They weren't asking for money anymore. They had created paperwork saying my home belonged to them. I didn't argue. I photographed every page, handed it back, and asked one question. "If this is really yours, why are you giving me 4 days instead of changing the locks today?" For half a second, neither of them answered. That silence told me more than the deed did. Then my mother smiled and said they would return Friday at 10 with movers, whether I was ready or not. I nodded. 10 works. They mistook my calm for surrender. What they didn't know was that someone had already tried using that same deed somewhere else, and by the time they came back with a moving truck, I intended to know exactly why. Before I tell you what was hiding behind that fake deed, and why I opened the door Friday morning smiling, tell me, what time is it where you are right now, and where are you watching from? I want to see just how far this story travels. 3 years earlier, I had inherited the property outside Santa Fe from my grandparents, along with very specific instructions that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with responsibility. The estate sat on 7 acres, but the number people obsessed over was the appraisal, $3.5 million. To me, it was the place where I had learned to work. My grandfather had let me turn an unused workshop into my first lighting studio when I was 22. By 29, I ran a small architectural lighting firm designing systems for galleries, boutique hotels, restaurants, and restored theaters across the Southwest. I wasn't a tech founder. I didn't have investors throwing money at me. I had 12 employees, clients who expected impossible deadlines, and a business built one contract at a time. My grandparents understood that because they had watched me build it. Richard and Diane Grant, my parents, mostly understood one thing: the estate was valuable. They had spent years treating every family asset like an unfinished negotiation. When my grandfather was alive, Dad once suggested selling the rear acreage because nobody needs 7 acres to grow herbs and collect old furniture. When Grandpa refused, Dad didn't speak to him for 4 months. Mom's method was softer. She would bring groceries, stay 30 minutes, then casually mention an investment, a renovation, a debt, or a temporary opportunity that somehow required somebody else's money. My grandparents eventually stopped discussing finances around them. After the estate came to me, my parents became unusually attentive. They asked what the annual taxes were, whether I had a mortgage, whether I planned to sell, whether the property was held personally or through a trust. I answered none of those questions in detail. That irritated them more than any argument could have. The fake deed changed the situation because it moved their behavior from entitlement into something tangible. As soon as they drove away, I called Caleb Brooks, the real estate attorney who had handled the final transfer after my grandparents' estate closed. I sent him the photographs. He called back 9 minutes later. "Do not contact them again until I check the county record." His voice had changed from conversational to clinical. That scared me more than Dad waving the deed. 40 minutes later, Caleb called again. The document had actually been recorded. Someone had managed to place a deed in the county system showing that I had transferred the property to a company I had never heard of, Mesa Verde Residential Holdings, LLC. Dad's name appeared as the company's manager. My supposed signature sat near the bottom. Beside it was notarization language claiming I had appeared before a notary 11 days earlier. 11 days earlier, I had been in Chicago supervising a hotel installation. I still had the boarding passes, hotel invoices, crew schedules, building access records, and photos from the job. That helps, Caleb said, but don't assume the deed is the whole play. I asked what he meant. People usually don't manufacture ownership paperwork just to frame it and admire it. They use it for something. That sentence stayed with me. We began pulling every record we legally could. Caleb contacted the county clerk about challenging the recording and preserving the submission information. I called my insurance carrier and placed a fraud alert on anything connected to the property. Then I froze my credit files. That last step felt paranoid until I checked my email and found something I had ignored 2 days earlier. A generic notification from a regional lender thanking Mesa Verde Residential Holdings for beginning a commercial property inquiry. I had assumed it was spam. It wasn't. Someone had listed my address as collateral information. That was when my anger changed. Up to that point, part of me had still wanted to believe my parents were bluffing to pressure me into giving them money. But a bluff does not need a recorded deed. A bluff does not need an LLC. A bluff does not start conversations with lenders. They hadn't come to discuss family rights. They had come to make sure I knew they believed their paperwork was already stronger than my resistance. That evening, an unknown number texted me. "You should take the Friday deadline seriously. Fighting this will cost you more than leaving." I stared at the message and almost replied. Caleb stopped me. "Screenshot it. Preserve it. Don't feed whoever sent it." 5 minutes later, another message came. "Your grandparents should have handled this differently." That second sentence caught my attention. Whoever had written it knew exactly how the property had come to me. I didn't feel frightened anymore. I felt focused. My parents had given me 4 days. Fine. I was going to use every hour. The next morning, Caleb and I met at his office rather than at my house. He had built a timeline across a conference table, my grandparents' estate documents, the legitimate deed transferring the property to me, the newly recorded deed, the LLC registration, the lender inquiry, my Chicago travel records, and screenshots of the anonymous messages. Looking at everything together changed the story. The fake deed was not an isolated threat. It was a bridge. Whoever created it appeared to be trying to create enough apparent ownership to control the property, approach a lender, and make my resistance look like the problem. Caleb pointed to the date the LLC had been created, 6 weeks earlier. That meant this had started long before Dad ever waved paper in my face. "They expected you to react emotionally," he said. "People make mistakes when they're defending themselves in real time." I almost laughed because that was exactly how my parents had always handled conflict. They would create urgency, demand an immediate answer, then describe any hesitation as selfishness. When I was 23, Mom called me during a client presentation because she needed $14,000 before the bank closed. When I asked why, she accused me of enjoying her embarrassment. When I was 25, Dad presented me with a partnership agreement for a business I had never discussed joining and acted offended that I wanted my attorney to read it. Their most reliable weapon had never been anger. It was the belief that asking questions made me disloyal. One memory from my grandparents' final years suddenly made sense in a new way. Dad had once arrived with papers he described as simple estate housekeeping. Grandpa read one page, folded the stack, and placed it back on the table. "You don't get signatures from people by exhausting them," he said. Dad left furious. At the time, I assumed it was another argument over money. Now I asked Caleb whether my grandparents' old files contained copies of those papers. They did. The proposal would have given Dad broad authority over certain property transactions. Grandpa had refused to sign. That detail didn't prove the current forgery, but it revealed a pattern I had never fully appreciated. Dad had been interested in control of the property before it was ever mine. By Wednesday afternoon, my parents began calling. I didn't answer. Mom left a voicemail in the soft voice she used whenever she wanted cruelty to sound reasonable. "Olivia, we're trying to give you time to arrange somewhere comfortable. Don't turn this into a legal circus. We can still help you if you cooperate. Help me. She was discussing removing me from my own home and somehow still assigning herself the role of rescuer. Dad's voicemail came 20 minutes later. The movers are booked. 10 Friday morning. Anything left in the house after noon becomes our problem. I forwarded both recordings to Caleb. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me since Monday. Why would they announce the movers if they're doing something illegal? Caleb leaned back. Because they may genuinely think the recorded document gives them enough leverage to scare you out before anyone examines it closely. Or because they want witnesses who have been told they're the owners. That gave me an idea. What happens if I let them come? Caleb looked at me for several seconds. Define let. I don't mean let them inside. I mean don't warn them we know everything. Let them arrive exactly as planned, with the movers, the document, whatever story they've prepared. He understood immediately. If they appeared with a moving company hired on the representation that they owned my property, their own conduct could clarify intent far better than another argument in my living room. Caleb told me not to turn it into amateur theater. We would document, not provoke. We would protect the property, not invite confrontation. That distinction mattered. I agreed. Then something happened that made Friday even more important. The moving company called me. A dispatcher named Melissa said she was confirming access instructions for a full residential turnover. I asked who had provided my number. She said it was listed as the occupant contact. The client, however, was Mesa Verde Residential Holdings. My parents had apparently told the company that they had recently acquired the estate after a family transfer, and that the current occupant had agreed to leave voluntarily. Melissa sounded confused when I said no such agreement existed. I did not blame her. Her company had been handed what looked like ownership documentation. I asked her not to cancel yet. Instead, I gave her Caleb's number. That night, the anonymous phone texted again. Don't make Friday ugly. This time I noticed something. My mother's voicemail had ended with almost the same phrase. Don't turn this into something ugly, Olivia. Was that proof? No. But it was enough to sharpen the question I wanted viewers to ask themselves. If somebody needs you frightened, rushed and silent before their plan works, are they protecting a right or protecting a lie? Thursday became the day everything underneath the fake deed started surfacing. Caleb learned that the lender inquiry had progressed further than either of us initially realized. No money had been released, but preliminary documents had been submitted seeking a substantial loan against the estate. The application valued the property at nearly the exact amount of my most recent appraisal, a figure I had never shared with my parents. That disturbed me. Only a handful of people had seen the appraisal. Me, Caleb, my insurer, the appraiser, and a secure file related to my grandparents' estate administration. Then I remembered something from 3 months earlier. Mom had come to my studio claiming she wanted to return one of Grandma's recipe boxes. I had been rushing to a site meeting, so I let her wait in my office while I finished a call in the workshop. My estate binder had been sitting on a shelf because I had just renewed the property insurance. I couldn't prove she opened it. I could prove she had been alone with it. The more we examined the lender package, the less this looked like parents irrationally claiming an inheritance, and the more it looked like people who believed paperwork could manufacture reality. A statement submitted with the application represented that Mesa Verde Residential Holdings had obtained the property through a voluntary intra-family transfer. Another represented that the property would soon be vacant. Suddenly, the Friday movers made perfect sense. An empty house would make their false story look much cleaner. If I left willingly, even under pressure, they could point to my absence and say the transfer had been accepted. They didn't necessarily need to win a lawsuit immediately. They needed me to behave as if they had already won. Caleb contacted the appropriate authorities and provided the records we had preserved. He was careful with his language. We're reporting suspected document and property fraud. We are not deciding who committed what. That's their job. I appreciated that because I wanted consequences rooted in evidence, not fantasy. I had spent too many years inside my parents' version of reality to start building my own version without proof. By Thursday evening, the legitimate ownership record had been formally challenged in connection with the disputed filing, the lender had frozen its review, and the moving company understood there was an active ownership dispute. The movers were willing to appear Friday only long enough to document who had hired them and clarify that they would not touch my belongings without lawful authorization. Caleb also arranged for law enforcement to be present because my parents had explicitly said they intended to remove property despite my objection. Nobody promised me handcuffs. Nobody promised a dramatic arrest. What they promised was simpler. The situation would have witnesses who could not be bullied by the phrase, "We're her parents." At 7:18 Thursday night, Dad finally sent me a direct text. "Be packed. We are not debating this tomorrow." At 7:24, the unknown number wrote, "Last warning." I placed both phones beside each other and stared at the screens. The timing was almost insulting. Then Caleb called with a detail from the documents that made my stomach tighten. The anonymous number had been listed as a secondary contact on one of the preliminary lender submissions. Not under my parents' names. Under Mesa Verde Residential Holdings. There was the payoff. The threat messages were no longer some random dramatic device floating outside the story. The number threatening me had been inserted into the same financial trail created around the forged deed. Caleb told me not to contact it, and I didn't. Instead, I printed the screenshots and added them to the folder on my kitchen table. That evening, for the first time all week, I thought about my grandparents rather than my parents. Grandma used to say that protecting something did not mean gripping it so tightly that fear controlled you. It meant understanding what it was for. The house had never been valuable to them because of the appraisal. Grandpa taught woodworking classes in the garage for free. Grandma hosted neighborhood fundraisers in the courtyard. They treated property as a responsibility, not a trophy. My parents saw $3.5 million and translated it into leverage. I saw the place where two people had taught me that stability could be created deliberately. At 9:03 p.m., Mom called once more. I answered this time. "Are you packed?" she asked. "No." Her silence lasted a beat. "Then tomorrow is going to be humiliating for you." I looked toward the guest room where Caleb had spent the previous hour reviewing documents with an investigator. "I don't think it will be," I said. "You still think somebody is going to save you?" That question almost made me smile. "No," I said. "That's the part you never understood. I stopped waiting for somebody to save me years ago." Then I ended the call. Friday morning I woke before 6 even though I had barely slept. I did not box my clothes. I did not hide valuables. I did not barricade the doors. I made coffee, fed the dog my neighbor had asked me to watch for the weekend, answered 2 emails from a restaurant project in Phoenix, and changed into jeans and a black sweater. Ordinary actions helped. My parents had spent 4 days trying to turn 10 o'clock Friday into some mythic deadline. I refused to participate. The house was still mine at 6:00, still mine at 7:15, still mine when Caleb arrived. At 8:05, carrying a laptop bag instead of a superhero cape. That mattered to me. In the old version of my life, I might have treated a lawyer like a shield and waited behind him while adults decided what happened to me. This time, Caleb was not there to rescue me. He was there because I had documented the problem, followed advice, preserved evidence, contacted the right institutions, and refused to be rushed out of my own decision-making. He reviewed the plan one last time. I would answer the door. I would not consent to entry. I would not argue about childhood. I would not touch their documents. If they presented the deed, I would ask them to state what they believed it authorized. Everything beyond that would be handled by the people whose job it was to handle it. 2 officers arrived shortly after 9 and waited out of immediate view inside the rear portion of the house after confirming the complaint history and the explicit messages about removing my property. A fraud investigator working with the matter remained with Caleb at the dining table. Again, there was nothing cinematic about it. Nobody was whispering about a sting operation. They were simply present because 2 people with disputed ownership documents had announced an intention to remove an occupant and her belongings. The ordinariness made it more powerful. At 9:47, Melissa from the moving company texted Caleb that the truck was a few minutes away. At 9:56, my security camera showed my parents' SUV turning onto the drive behind a white moving truck. Dad had arrived wearing a sport coat. Mom had sunglasses on despite the cloudy morning. They looked like people attending a closing. At exactly 10:00, the doorbell rang. I picked up my coffee and opened the door. "Right on time," I said. Dad's expression told me he had expected boxes stacked behind me. Instead, he saw the same entryway he had stood in Monday. Nothing packed. Nothing surrendered. He looked past my shoulder. "Where are your things?" "Inside." Mom stepped forward. "Olivia, don't start. We gave you 4 days." Behind them, 3 movers stood near the truck, visibly uncomfortable. Their supervisor held a tablet and glanced from my parents to me. Dad removed the deed from a leather folder and raised it like a badge. "This property belongs to Mesa Verde Residential Holdings. I'm the manager." She was given notice. I took a sip of coffee. "Can you say that again?" He frowned. "What?" "That the company owns the property, and that you're its manager." "Of course I'm the manager." Mom snapped. "Why are you acting stupid? Open the door wider." I didn't move. "And you hired these movers to remove everything today?" "Yes," Dad said. "Anything you leave becomes ours to deal with." The moving supervisor interrupted. "Sir, just so we're clear, we were told the occupant had agreed to vacate." "She did," Mom said instantly. I looked at her. "When?" Her head turned toward me. "Don't play games." "No. I'm asking because I'd like to know when I supposedly agreed." Dad lost patience. "Your agreement isn't relevant anymore. We have the deed." That was the sentence Caleb had wanted documented. Not because it magically proved every allegation, but because Dad himself had now stated, in front of neutral witnesses, that he intended to rely on the disputed deed despite my explicit objection. The moving supervisor stepped backward. "We are not entering under these circumstances." Dad turned on him. "I paid your company. And our office notified us there's a title dispute. We're not moving property without lawful confirmation." Mom's confidence cracked for the first time. She stared at me. "You called them?" "I answered when they called me." Dad pointed the folder toward my face. "You think sabotaging the movers changes ownership?" "No," I said. "That's what the actual ownership records are for." Then he did exactly what Caleb suspected he might do. Dad stepped toward the threshold as though simply crossing it would settle the argument. I raised one hand. "I do not consent to you entering. This is my house. I do not consent to you entering." Mom laughed sharply. "She's performing now." "No," a voice behind me said. "She's being very clear." Caleb stepped into view. Dad's face tightened. "Of course." But Caleb wasn't the surprise. The 2 officers walked into the entryway behind him. Mom took off her sunglasses. Dad stopped moving. For the first time all week, nobody in my family had anything clever to say. Dad recovered first. "Officers, good," he said, holding out the deed. "You can explain to my daughter that she is refusing to leave property legally transferred to my company." One officer took the copy and asked, "Are you Richard Grant?" Dad said yes. "And you represent Mesa Verde Residential Holdings?" Another yes. "And you arranged for these movers to remove property today?" Dad hesitated. "We arranged a lawful move." Mom jumped in. Olivia is upset because this is family. She's turning a business matter into revenge. That word told me exactly what she wanted. An emotional daughter was easier to dismiss than a property owner reporting a forged document. Caleb spoke behind me. Ms. Grant has not consented to any transfer. She has disputed this deed, and she has documentation proving she was in Chicago on the date it claims she personally signed before a notary. Dad turned toward him. Documents can be signed electronically. Caleb barely reacted. This one specifically says otherwise. Dad's jaw tightened. Then Mara Bennett, the fraud investigator, stepped forward. Mr. Grant, I'd like to speak with you regarding this deed and a financing application connected to Mesa Verde Residential Holdings. Mom's face changed before Dad's did. Dad tried to sound confused. Financing application? An application referencing this property as collateral. I don't discuss private finances on a doorstep. You don't have to, Mara said. But records connected to that application are under review, including a phone number that appears connected to messages sent to Ms. Grant this week. Dad looked straight at me. I said nothing. The anonymous threats had finally entered the room. Mom snapped, "Anybody can put a phone number on a form." Mara nodded. "That is something investigators can determine." Dad tried another tactic. "This is harassment. My daughter is angry about inheritance issues and is weaponizing police against us." One officer handed the deed back. "Whatever civil ownership argument you believe you have, the current occupant disputes it and has denied entry. You cannot use movers to force access today." Dad raised the paper. "So this means nothing?" Caleb answered. "A piece of paper is exactly why everyone is standing here." He opened his laptop and showed the timeline. The legitimate deed transferring the estate to me, the LLC formed 6 weeks before the confrontation, the disputed deed, my Chicago records, the lender inquiry, the statement claiming the property would be vacant, the moving order describing me as a voluntary departing occupant, and the anonymous number tied to the financial submission. "You didn't bring movers because Olivia owed you a conversation," Caleb said. "You needed the house vacant because that supported what was represented elsewhere." Dad stared at him. "That's your interpretation?" "Exactly," Caleb replied. "Which is why the records are being preserved and reviewed." Mom turned to me. "You knew? Enough? And you still let us come here?" The question almost stunned me. She sounded offended that I had allowed them to carry out the plan they had announced themselves. "You told me you were coming," I said. "I believed you." The moving supervisor looked down, hiding his reaction. Mom lowered her voice. "Olivia, we can still fix this privately." I asked, "Fix which part? The deed? The LLC? The lender? The movers? Or the messages?" "Stop." "Which part, Mom?" Dad snapped. "Enough." That word had ended arguments my entire life. This time it didn't. "No," I said. "You gave me until Friday. It's Friday." Mara asked Dad whether he would provide contact information for his attorney. He replied that his lawyer would call. Mom whispered something to him, and Dad answered too loudly. "The loan never funded." Silence followed. Dad seemed to realize instantly what he had admitted. Mara remained calm. Whether money was released does not resolve how the supporting documents were created. The officers told my parents they had to leave and could not force entry or remove property. The lender review was frozen. The fake deed was being challenged. Their company was now connected to a formal investigation instead of a multi-million-dollar estate. Then the moving supervisor stepped toward Dad. "Because the ownership information provided to us is materially disputed, our company will preserve its records and cooperate with lawful requests. We're terminating the job." Dad frowned. "What about my deposit?" "You'll need to speak with billing." Watching him realize he had paid thousands of dollars to bring neutral witnesses to his own failed eviction nearly made me laugh. Instead, Dad looked at me. "You're enjoying this?" "No," I said. I'm understanding it. What does that mean? It means I spent years thinking you wanted a relationship. Then I thought you wanted money. Now I understand you wanted access to documents, property, decisions, anything you could turn into leverage. Mom shook her head. After everything we did for you. I didn't list old grievances. I didn't need them anymore. Doing something for someone does not purchase ownership of them later. Mom stared at me. Behind her, the movers closed the truck. Dad slid the fake deed back into his folder. It no longer looked like a weapon. It looked like evidence. 4 days earlier, Mom had promised I would be out by Friday. At 10:38 Friday morning, she was the one walking down my driveway. The real consequences unfolded over the following months, because accountability rarely ends neatly at the front door. Caleb worked through the formal process to clear the title. The lender froze and preserved its file. Records tied to Mesa Verde residential holdings were reviewed, and my parents had to hire their own attorney. The confidence Dad had shown while waiving that deed disappeared under legal bills, document requests, formal responses, and questions from people who were not emotionally connected to him. I won't pretend everything became an instant criminal conviction, because real investigations do not work that way. What mattered was what could be established. The false transfer was ultimately removed from the title chain. The financing attempt failed. Their effort to control my estate collapsed. And they faced substantial legal costs and civil exposure connected to the fraudulent filing and attempted interference with my property. More importantly, they lost the ambiguity they had relied on. They could no longer tell relatives this was simply a family misunderstanding. There was a disputed signature, an LLC created weeks in advance, a lender file, a moving contract, threatening messages, and neutral witnesses. Some relatives still tried to pressure me. One aunt asked if I really had to take it this far. I asked her, "At what dollar amount does forged consent become serious enough to defend yourself?" She had no answer. Another relative said my parents were humiliated. I told him humiliation was not the same thing as injustice. That distinction stayed with me. People who benefit from silence often describe accountability as cruelty because accountability changes who must carry the discomfort. I also changed how I protected the estate. I moved sensitive records out of my casual home office, strengthened identity and title monitoring, reviewed access permissions, and documented important financial boundaries. Not because I wanted to live in fear, but because knowledge is a form of independence. The practical lesson was simple. When someone creates urgency around money, property, inheritance, or contracts, slow everything down. Verify documents independently. Preserve communications. Ask qualified professionals before signing. Never confuse emotional pressure with legal authority. The deeper lesson was about boundaries. For years, I thought a boundary was something you announced and hoped another person respected. I learned that a boundary is actually a decision about what you will do when they refuse. "Please stop asking me for money" is a request. "I will not fund this, and I will end the conversation if you pressure me" is a boundary. "Respect my house" is a request. "You do not have permission to enter, and I will document attempts to force access" is a boundary. That difference changed far more than my relationship with my parents. I also decided the estate should represent what my grandparents valued, not simply what it was worth. Twice a month, I began using the old workshop for free evening sessions with young designers and local business owners who wanted practical education about contracts, pricing, project documentation, and creative careers. Grandpa would have liked that. He always believed property should create possibilities instead of becoming a trophy. Months later, I sat at the same kitchen table where Caleb had once spread the evidence. The house was quiet. No threatening messages, no folders marked vacate, no Friday deadline hanging over me. I remembered Mom asking, "You still think somebody is going to save you?" She had misunderstood everything. Caleb mattered. The officers mattered. Mara mattered. Documentation mattered. But none of them could have protected my rights if I had surrendered them first, because the people pressuring me happened to be family. That became the final lesson I carried forward. Love can be generous without being defenseless. Compassion does not require unlimited access. Forgiveness, if you choose it, does not require restoring someone to the same position from which they harmed you. Family history does not outrank informed consent. My parents came to my $3.5 million estate believing a fake deed and a moving truck could create a new reality before I challenged them. Instead, they taught me something worth more than the property itself. A signature can be copied. A story can be manipulated. A family title can be used as pressure. But consent still belongs to the person giving it. Once I understood that, nobody could evict me from my own life again.